The wind on Elk Ridge had a voice. It was not a whisper, but a low, mournful moan that combed through the pines and scoured the granite faces of the peaks. Elias McKenna knew its language. He knew its bite meant snow was coming, not the gentle powder of early autumn, but the heavy, wet snow of true winter, the kind that could bury a man and his mistakes. He pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat tighter, the worn wool rough against his jaw. His breath plumed white in the frigid air, a fleeting ghost in a world of stone and timber. He was 33 years old, and felt as ancient as the mountains themselves. His snowshoes made a soft, rhythmic crunch as he checked the last of his trap lines. The steel jaws of the traps were empty today, save for one unfortunate rabbit. He reset them with methodical, calloused hands, his movements economical and sure. There was a quiet satisfaction in the work, in the simple logic of survival. Here, there was no need for the silver-tongued lies of men like Cassius Bixby, no room for the compromised justice of a man like Sheriff Harlan Pike. Here, there was only the cold, the hunger, and the stark, honest struggle for life. It was a cleaner world than the one he had left behind in the valley below. Silvergate, the name itself was a promise and a curse, nestled in a narrow valley carved by Glacier Creek. The town was a raw wound on the landscape, a chaotic sprawl of raw timber buildings and muddy streets, all of it trembling with the fever of the silver rush. Elias had once been a part of that fever. He had worn a gun on his hip not for hunting, but for guarding the interests of the Silvergate Consolidated Mining Company. He had been a scout, a protector of their claims. His skill with a rifle and his knowledge of the land sold to the highest bidder. The memory left a sour taste in his mouth, a stain he felt could never be washed clean. That was why he was here. On this mountain, he was saving every dollar from his pelts and bounty hunts, his eyes on a small parcel of land down south, a place where he could build a real fence, not to keep the world out, but to hold a quiet life in, a place to be forgotten. He turned his gaze downward. From this vantage, Silvergate looked like a child's discarded toy set, insignificant against the vast, looming wilderness. But he knew the power it held. It was a place where a piece of paper, a contract signed in ink, could bind a person tighter than any iron chain. He had seen it happen. He had stood by and let it happen. The guilt was a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of his solitude, a ghost that sat by his fire on the longest nights. Rumors drifted up from the town like smoke, carried by the occasional prospector or hunter who passed his way. Talk of company dealings, of men getting rich and others getting broken. Lately, there had been a new story, a whisper about a young woman from the convent, an orphan indentured to the mine who had vanished, a runaway. They called her a debtor. Elias had paid it little mind. The company's cruelty was as predictable as the changing seasons. It was not his fight, not anymore. As the first thick flakes of snow began to drift from a sky the color of lead, Elias slung the rabbit over his shoulder and started the trek back to his cabin. It was a small, sturdy structure he had built with his own hands, tucked into a grove of aspens that offered some shelter from the wind. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a welcome signal of warmth and safety. A lantern hung from a peg by the door, its glass clean, its wick trimmed, ready for the coming darkness. It was a small ritual, keeping the lantern ready, but it was his. It was a pinprick of light against the immense, gathering dark, a quiet act of defiance. Rosalie's heart ran until her lungs burned with the icy air and her legs felt like lead. The thin woolen cloak she wore was a poor defense against the wind, which seemed to find every gap and seam, chilling her to the bone. She did not dare look back. Behind her was the mining camp, the grease-slicked kitchen, the leering eyes of the foreman, and the suffocating weight of a debt that was not her own. She was 22 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was utterly alone. The convent had been her only home. It was a life of quiet routine, of prayer and scrubbing floors. But it had been safe. The sisters had been kind. If distant, she was an orphan, a ward of the church, and she had known her place. Then her benefactor, a man she had never met, had died, and his debts had apparently become hers. One day she was mending linens in the quiet solitude of the nunnery, and the next she was standing before a cold-eyed lawyer named Cassius Bixby, a piece of paper in his hand that he claimed was her future. It was a contract of indenture, her labor in the kitchens of the Silvergate Consolidated Mine until the debt was paid, a debt whose sum seemed to grow with every word he spoke. The kitchen was a special kind of hell. The heat was suffocating, the work was endless, and the hope was non-existent. She was a possession, no different from a mule or a sack of flour. The moment she understood that, the moment she saw the deadness in the eyes of the other women, she knew she could not stay. So she had waited for the cover of a brewing storm, and she had run, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate prayer on her lips. Freedom. The word was a fragile, fluttering thing in her mind. What did it even mean for her? It was the simple, impossible dream of a place to call her own. A small house, a garden, a door she could lock from the inside, a life that belonged to her. That dream was what propelled her now, pushing her up the rocky, pine-choked slopes, away from the town and the law that served it. The snow began to fall in earnest, the flakes growing fat and heavy. They clung to her eyelashes and melted on her cheeks, mingling with the hot tears of fear and exhaustion. The trail she had been following disappeared. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. She was lost. She stumbled on, her direction guided only by a desperate instinct to keep climbing, to put more distance between herself and her pursuers. The wind howled, snatching the breath from her lungs. Every tree looked the same, every rock a potential threat. She fell, her hands scraping against the icy ground, and for a moment she thought of giving up. It would be so easy to simply lie down, to let the snow cover her like a blanket and drift into a final, peaceful sleep. But then, through the blinding curtain of the blizzard, she saw it. A light. It was faint, a tiny, warm spark of orange in the vast, cold emptiness. Hope surged through her, a current so powerful it brought her back to her feet. A lantern. Someone was out here. She fixed her eyes on that small, steady glow and forced her frozen limbs to move, one agonizing step at a time. It was a beacon, a promise. It had to be. The journey toward the light was an eternity. She fell again and again, crawling the last few yards through the deepening drifts. Her knuckles were raw and bleeding when she finally reached the source of the light, a small log cabin, so blanketed in snow it seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The lantern hung beside a solid, wooden door. Warmth and the smell of wood smoke radiated from the structure, a scent so comforting it almost broke her. She lifted a trembling hand and knocked. The sound was feeble, swallowed by the roar of the storm. She waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Had they heard her? Was anyone even there? She gathered the last of her strength and knocked again, harder this time, her fist striking the solid wood. The door creaked open. A man stood there, filling the entire frame. He was huge, broad-shouldered and tall, his silhouette a dark mountain against the warm light of the cabin's interior. His face was shadowed, defined by a thick beard and lines etched by sun and hardship. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, took in her wretched state, her torn cloak, her shivering frame, the desperation plain on her face. He did not look surprised, nor did he look angry. He simply looked. Rosalie's voice was a choked, broken thing, barely a whisper against the wind. "Good Lord, please, may I have shelter for the night?" Elias McKenna looked at the young woman huddled on his doorstep, a ghost conjured by the storm. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, a flicker of something else, something resilient, something that had driven her this far. He recognized the look of a hunted animal. He had seen it many times before, He stepped back, holding the door wide. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, as steady and solid as the cabin around them, yet touched with a warmth that cut through the storm's fury. "Come in," he said. "No one gets left out in a storm tonight." The world returned to Rosalie in pieces. First, the scent of coffee, rich and dark, a luxury she had not known since leaving the convent. Then, the comforting weight of a heavy wool blanket and the crackle of a fire nearby. She opened her eyes to a room bathed in the soft, gray light of a winter morning. The cabin was a single, small space, impeccably clean and ordered. Tools hung from pegs on the wall, and shelves held neatly stacked supplies. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. She was lying on a simple cot, and across the room, the large man from the night before sat at a small table, nursing a tin cup of coffee. He was watching the fire, his profile rugged and still, looking as much a part of the landscape as the mountains outside. He must have sensed her stirring, because he turned his head. His eyes met hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was no threat in his gaze, only a quiet, searching quality. "The storm has passed," he said, his voice a low burr that seemed to fit the quiet of the morning. "There is stew. You should eat." He did not ask her name or her story. He simply stated a fact and made an offer. Rosalie sat up, the blanket pooling around her waist. She felt a profound sense of shame at her ragged appearance, but a deeper sense of gratitude that was so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. She quickly blinked them away. Crying would solve nothing. He ladled a thick, savory stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to her, along with a piece of hard bread. She ate with a hunger that surprised her, the warmth spreading through her limbs, chasing away the last of the deep, penetrating cold. As she ate, she studied him. He was not a handsome man in the way of the townsfolk, but his face had a strength and a certainty to it that was more compelling than any shallow charm. His hands, wrapped around his coffee cup, were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard for everything he had. When she finished, she placed the empty bowl on the floor. "Thank you," she said, her voice still hoarse. "You saved my life." He gave a slight nod, his gaze returning to the fire. "The mountain decides who lives. I just opened the door." A silence settled between them, not awkward, but comfortable. While he cleaned their bowls, Rosalie noticed a pile of mending in a basket by the hearth. A shirt with a torn sleeve, a blanket with a frayed edge. Without thinking, she picked up the blanket and a needle and thread from the basket. Her fingers, though stiff with cold, found the familiar rhythm of the stitches. It was a small act, a way to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before turning to stare out the small window. The peace was shattered by a sound that did not belong in this high, lonely place. The crunch of many feet on snow, the jingle of a horse's harness, the low murmur of men's voices. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his body tense. He moved to the door, his hand resting not on a pistol, but on the heavy iron latch. Rosalie's heart seized in her chest. They had found her. Elias opened the door a crack and looked out. 4 men stood there, their horses steaming in the cold air. 2 were company men, their faces hard and nondescript. The other 2, Rosalie recognized with a jolt of pure terror, Sheriff Harlan Pike, his portly frame squeezed into a thick coat, his face flushed and impatient, and beside him, the architect of her misery, Cassius Bixby. The lawyer was impeccably dressed despite the climb, his thin lips pressed into a supercilious line, his eyes cold and gray like river stones. He held a roll of paper in his gloved hand. "McKenna," Sheriff Pike grunted, his voice carrying an official weight that was entirely unearned. "We have reason to believe you are harboring a fugitive, property of the Silvergate Consolidated Mining Company." Bixby stepped forward, his gaze flicking past Elias to fix on Rosalie, who shrank back from the open doorway. A smug, triumphant smile touched his lips. "Miss Hart, I am so pleased you are safe. Your employers were deeply concerned." "She is no one's property," Elias said, his voice flat and even. He did not move from the doorway. A solid, immovable object. Bixby unrolled the paper with a theatrical flourish. "On the contrary, this contract of indenture, legally signed and witnessed, states that her labor is pledged to the company until such time as the debts of her late guardian are settled in full. With interest, of course. She is an asset, and by running, she has committed theft. Sheriff, I believe you have the authority to return this asset to its rightful place." The lawyer's words were a physical blow. Rosalie felt the air leave her lungs. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, washed over her. She had brought this man's quiet life crashing down. She had repaid his kindness with violence and trouble. Elias's gaze shifted from Bixby to Rosalie. He saw her pale face, the tremor in her hands, the utter despair in her eyes. He saw the convent girl, the orphan, the runaway. But he also saw the young woman who had survived a blizzard, who had the courage to run, who had sat by his fire and quietly stitched his life back together one thread at a time. The quiet piece of land he had been dreaming of, the solitary peace he had craved, seemed to recede, growing distant and unimportant. What was a fence around an empty field compared to the life of the person cowering behind him, the ghost of his past? The man who had stood by and done nothing rose up before him. He would not be that man again. He turned his full attention back to the men on his doorstep. His voice was dangerously soft. "She is not going anywhere." Sheriff Pike bristled, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. "Now you listen here. McKenna, I am the law in this territory, and I am deputizing these men to enforce it. You will stand aside." Elias did not move a muscle. He did not need a gun to be intimidating. His stillness was a threat in itself. "You are the company's law, Pike, and your authority ends where my property begins. You are trespassing." A tense silence fell over the clearing. The company men shifted nervously. They were in the heart of the wilderness, far from the safety of town. This was McKenna's world, and they knew it. Bixby, ever the pragmatist, saw that brute force would be costly. He raised a placating hand. "There is no need for unpleasantness. We will handle this through legal channels." He fixed Elias with a look of cold condescension. "You are making a grave error, McKenna, but so be it." He addressed the sheriff. "We will return to Silvergate and secure the proper warrants." He then looked directly at Elias, his voice dripping with venom. "You have 3 days. There will be a hearing before the magistrate in Silvergate. You will produce Miss Hart at that time. If you fail to appear, a federal marshal will be dispatched to arrest you for harboring a fugitive, obstructing justice, and theft of company property. The law is a powerful and meticulous machine. McKenna, it will grind you into dust. 3 days." With that, he turned, and the 4 men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving deep tracks in the pristine snow. The silence they left behind was profound, heavy with the weight of the ultimatum. The door clicked shut, and the small cabin suddenly felt like a cage. Rosalie finally broke, a sob catching in her throat. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her hands covering her face. "I have to leave. I cannot let you be ruined because of me. I will go back." Elias walked over to her and gently took her wrists. Pulling her hands away from her face, he looked down at her, his expression serious. "No," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "If you go back, you will disappear into that mine. We are past that now. Your fight is my fight." "But the law," she began, her voice trembling. "Bixby's law," he corrected her. "It is a piece of paper meant to scare people. We will not be scared." But he could feel a cold dread settling in his stomach. He had defied the company, the most powerful force in the territory. He had made an enemy of a man who wielded the law like a club. His dream of a quiet life was not just distant now. It was ash. Later that afternoon, as the sun cast long blue shadows across the snow. Rosalie found herself unable to be still. She needed to do something, anything, to feel less helpless. She found the mending basket again, but this time she pulled out a collection of colorful fabric scraps, squares of calico, strips of wool, triangles of flannel, remnants of a life she could not see. With the same quiet determination she had shown that morning, she began to lay them out on the floor, arranging them into a simple pattern. She began to sew the small pieces together, her needle flying with a practiced grace, a patchwork quilt. It was a slow, painstaking process, joining disparate, discarded pieces into a single, unified whole, a thing of warmth and purpose. Elias watched her, the rhythmic push and pull of the needle, a calming sound in the tense silence of the cabin. 2 broken lives, he thought, sitting in a small cabin on the edge of the world, trying to stitch together a future out of scraps. They had 3 days. The morning broke clear and cold, the sky a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The blizzard had scoured the landscape clean, leaving behind a world of blinding white and sharp, black shadows. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken tension. They had 2 days left. The sanctuary of the mountain had become a prison with a deadline. It was Rosalie who spoke first, her voice quiet but firm as she folded the half-finished quilt. "We cannot win this fight by hiding up here," she said, not looking at him. "Your cabin will not stand up in a courtroom." Elias, who had been staring out the window at the tracks left by Bixby's men, turned to her. He saw a change in her. The frightened, desperate girl who had collapsed at his door was gone. In her place was a woman with a core of quiet steel. She was right. Hiding was a slow death. His own instincts, honed by years on the frontier, told him the same thing. You do not wait for the predator to come to you. You meet it on your own terms. "No," he agreed. "We go down to Silvergate. We go today." Their journey down the mountain was the opposite of her desperate flight up. They moved with purpose, Elias leading the way, his long strides eating up the miles, his rifle resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. Rosalie followed, her steps surprisingly sure. The air warmed as they descended, and the sound of dripping water was everywhere as the sun began its work on the fresh snow. Glacier Creek, which had been frozen solid along its banks, now showed a dark, churning channel of water in its center, a vein of life returning to the frozen land. It felt like an omen, a promise that things could thaw. That movement was possible. They were halfway to the valley floor, traversing a wide, open meadow, when a sound made Elias freeze. It was a high, thin cry of terror, followed by the low, guttural snarl of a wolf. He held up a hand, and Rosalie stopped instantly. He scanned the trees at the far edge of the meadow. He saw movement, a flash of gray, then another. "Stay here," he commanded in a low voice, shrugging off his pack. Before she could protest, he was moving, not running, but loping across the snow with a speed and silence that was unnerving. As he drew closer, the scene came into sharp focus. A small boy, no older than 10, was backed up against a rock outcropping. He was holding a broken branch like a sword, his face pale with terror. A pack of 4 gray wolves circled him, their movements fluid and predatory, their yellow eyes fixed on their prey. They were gaunt from the long winter, their ribs showing. They were desperate. Elias raised his rifle, but he did not fire. He was still too far for a clean shot that would not endanger the boy. He let out a piercing whistle instead, a sound that cut through the air like a whip. The wolves' heads snapped up, their attention diverted. They saw the new threat, a large man, a much greater challenge. One of the wolves, the alpha, let out a low growl and took a step toward Elias, its lips curling back to reveal yellowed fangs. Elias did not hesitate. He fired, not at the wolf, but at the snow a few feet in front of it. The crack of the rifle echoed through the valley like a thunderclap, and snow and ice exploded into the air. The pack scattered, startled and confused. He fired again, this time into the branches of a pine tree above their heads, sending a shower of snow and needles down on them. That was enough. With yelps of alarm, they turned and vanished back into the deep woods. He reached the boy, who was now sobbing with relief. The broken branch dropped at his feet. Elias knelt, his voice gentle. "Are you hurt, son?" The boy, whose name was Ben, shook his head, unable to speak. By the time Rosalie reached them, her heart pounding, Elias had the boy wrapped in his own coat, murmuring reassuring words. She knelt beside them, her hand finding the boy's shoulder. She saw in Elias's eyes not the cold efficiency of a hunter, but the deep, instinctual kindness of a protector. It was a side of him she had only glimpsed, and it stirred something warm and profound within her. They walked Ben back to the edge of town, where a frantic mother and father were calling his name. The reunion was tearful and grateful, and, for a moment, Elias and Rosalie were heroes. But as they walked down the main street of Silvergate, the atmosphere shifted. The mud was ankle-deep, a thick, gray slurry mixed with snow and horse manure. The town smelled of coal smoke, stale beer, and desperation. Men stopped and stared as they passed. They recognized Elias McKenna. Whispers followed them like ghosts. The company man, the hermit from the mountain, and the girl with him had to be the runaway from the convent. They were a spectacle, a scandal walking in plain sight. Elias ignored the stares. His focus was absolute. He led Rosalie to the Golden Garter Saloon. It was early in the day, and the place was mostly empty, save for a few hardened prospectors nursing drinks at the bar. A woman with fiery red hair sat at the piano, idly playing a melancholic tune. "Nora," Elias said, his voice quiet. Nora Bell stopped playing and turned. She was not beautiful, but her face was intelligent and her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. She took in Elias, then Rosalie, and a flicker of understanding crossed her features. "McKenna," she said, her voice husky. "I heard you had company. Did not figure you for the charitable type." "I need your help," he said, getting straight to the point. He told her the story, his voice low and urgent, while Rosalie stood silently by his side, her presence a testament to the truth of his words. Nora listened, her expression growing more serious with every sentence. When he was finished, she was silent for a long time, her fingers tracing a pattern on the dusty piano keys. "Bixby is a snake," she said finally, "and that contract sounds like his kind of poison. I used to do some of the bookkeeping for the company, before I decided I liked my soul right where it is." She sighed. "I do not have access to the main ledgers, but I remember something about the tailings dam." "What about it?" Elias prompted. "There was a special fund," she said, her eyes distant with memory, "for maintenance and reinforcement. A lot of money was put into it, especially after the spring thaws last year, but the work was never done. I saw vouchers, special payments for consulting fees and legal expenses. All signed by Bixby. The money just vanished. It was not proof, but it was a crack in the company's pristine facade, a secret weakness." "Thank you." "Nora," Elias said, his voice filled with a gratitude he rarely showed. "Do not thank me yet," she cautioned. "Bixby buries his secrets deep. Be careful, Elias. He does not just defeat his enemies, he erases them." Their next stop was the small, clapboard church at the end of the street. Inside, it was cold and smelled of damp wood and old hymns. Reverend Ames was a thin, stooped man with kind, weary eyes. He remembered Rosalie immediately, a sad smile touching his lips. "My child," he said, taking her hands in his. "We were so worried. The company said you had run off, that you were in their debt." Rosalie, finding her voice, explained everything. She spoke of the contract, of the threats, of the kindness of the stranger who had taken her in. As she spoke, the Reverend's expression shifted from concern to a quiet, righteous anger. An indenture contract, he said, his voice shaking slightly. That is an abomination. Your guardian, Mr. Abernathy, may he rest in peace, left his affairs in a tangle. It is true. But he settled all his accounts with the church. There was no debt assigned to you. None. He went to a heavy, locked chest in the corner of his office and pulled out a large, leather-bound ledger. He ran a bony finger down the pages, his lips moving silently. Ah, here it is. He turned the book around for them to see. The entry was clear. Rosalie Hart, ward of the church. Her care and keep provided for by a stipend from the estate of Jonathan Abernathy, paid in full upon his death. There was no mention of the mining company, no mention of labor or debt. And at the bottom of the page was a signature, the shaky, uncertain script of a young woman who had just learned to write her own name. It was nothing like the bold, confident signature on the document Bixby had shown them. "This is a forgery," Elias said, his voice a low growl. Without a doubt, the Reverend confirmed. He carefully copied the page for them, signing and stamping it with the church's seal. "This is a legal document. It is proof. May God grant that it is enough." That evening, in a small, clean room, Nora had helped them secure at the back of the boarding house. The weight of the day finally settled on Elias. They had a sliver of hope, a piece of paper to fight Bixby's paper, but he knew it was not that simple. He watched Rosalie take out her patchwork quilt, her hands moving with a soothing, steady rhythm. He had to tell her. She had to know who was fighting for her. "When I first came to this territory," he began, his voice rough, "I did not hunt. I carried a gun for the company." Rosalie stopped sewing and looked at him, her eyes wide and questioning in the lamplight. "There was a trail," he continued, staring at the floor, "a shortcut through the mountains that the company wanted. But there were homesteaders on that land, families. They had claims, but the company's claims were older, or so they said. My job was to persuade them to leave." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that was painful to see. "We burned their fences. We diverted their water. We stood there with rifles while they packed their wagons and left with nothing. I took their money and told myself it was just a job, that I was just following orders." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and ugly. He had been one of them. He had been the instrument of the very same cruelty that now threatened her. "I left after that," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I went up on the mountain to forget, but you cannot outrun a thing like that." He looked at her, and his voice gained a sliver of strength. "When Bixby showed up at my door, when I saw what they were doing to you, it was like seeing it all over again. But from the other side, I could not stand by again. I will not." Rosalie put down her sewing and crossed the small room. She stood before him and, to his astonishment, she placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it sent a shock through him. "You are not that man anymore." "Elias," she said softly. He had told her his name on the long walk down, and she used it now for the first time. It sounded different in her voice. That man would not have opened his door in a storm. He looked down at her small hand on his worn sleeve and felt the ice that had been locked around his heart for years begin to crack. As they left the church earlier, a young deputy with clear, honest eyes had watched them go. He had not sneered or whispered like the others. He had given Elias a short, respectful nod. His name, they learned, was Abel Crow. It was not much, but like the Reverend's document and Nora's information, it was something, a single, solid stitch in the patchwork of a defense they were trying to create. It was not enough, not yet, but it was a start. Nora's words about the Tailings Dam Fund were a flickering candle in a dark room, but her mention of Silas Croft, the company accountant who had died the previous winter, was the flint and steel that might spark a real fire. Croft, she had told them, was a timid man, terrified of his employers but obsessed with his ledgers. He lived alone in a derelict cabin 2 miles north of Elias's own, a place even more remote and forgotten. "If Bixby has a secret buried in paper," Nora had said, "Silas Croft is the man who would have marked the grave." They had one day left. Returning to the mountain was a risk, but staying in Silvergate with nothing but the Reverend's document felt like walking into a bear trap with a prayer for a shield. They set out as the sun rose, climbing back into the high country. A new dynamic existed between them. They were no longer a rescuer and a victim, but partners on a desperate mission. Rosalie matched his pace, her gaze scanning the trees with a newfound alertness. And Elias found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him, a steady warmth against the vast, cold indifference of the wilderness. By midday, the sun was high and surprisingly warm, melting the last of the blizzard's snow in bright, trickling streams. They stopped in a small, sheltered meadow where Glacier Creek pooled into a deep, clear basin before tumbling over a series of smooth, gray stones. The place was intensely private, walled in by granite and ancient pines. The days of travel, the grime of the town, and the constant gnawing fear had left Rosalie feeling soiled, inside and out. She looked at the clear, sunlit water, and a powerful need washed over her, a longing to be clean, to feel the water wash away more than just the dust of the road. "I need to bathe," she said, the words coming out as a simple statement of fact. Elias looked at the pool, then at her. He understood immediately. It was not about vanity. It was about reclaiming some small piece of herself. He gave a single, slow nod. "The water upstream will be cleaner for drinking," he said, picking up their 2 canteens. "I will be back in a while." He did not make it a grand gesture, but the simple, respectful way he gave her space was a kindness more profound than any flowery speech. He disappeared into the trees, and Rosalie was alone with the sound of the water and the whisper of the wind. She quickly shed her heavy traveling clothes, her movements furtive at first, then more confident. The shock of the icy water took her breath away, but it was a clean, sharp pain that quickly gave way to a tingling sense of life. She submerged herself, the current pulling gently at her limbs. For a few precious moments, she was not a runaway, not a debtor, not a pawn in a rich man's game. She was just a woman, alone in the vastness of God's creation. The sun warm on her face, Elias moved through the woods with practiced silence. He filled the canteens and was making his way back when he emerged from the trees at a different angle than he had left. He saw her before she saw him, and he stopped dead, his breath catching in his throat. She was rising from the water, her back to him. He saw not the details of her form, but an image of stunning, vulnerable beauty. The sunlight turned the water cascading from her shoulders into a shower of diamonds. Steam rose in a faint mist around her, softening the sharp lines of the world. Her dark hair was plastered to the elegant curve of her neck. It was a scene so pure, so private, that looking felt like a transgression. His eyes took in the sight. A memory seared into his mind, an image of grace and light in a world that had shown him so little of either. She must have felt his presence, a shift in the air, because she turned. Her eyes widened, and a deep blush spread from her neck to her cheeks. She crossed her arms over her chest, a futile gesture of modesty. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the sun-dappled water. Her voice, when it came, was a breathy whisper, a mixture of embarrassment and a strange, disarming honesty. "Elias," she murmured, "you are such a large man. I fear I might break." A jolt went through him, a powerful, protective instinct that warred with a sudden, fierce desire. He could have crossed the stream in 3 strides. He could have taken her in his arms and shown her that her fears were baseless. But the memory of the men he used to be, the men who took what they wanted without asking, rose like a foul taste in his mouth. He would not be that man. He turned his back to her, a gesture of absolute, deliberate respect. His face was a hard mask of control. He walked to the bank where her clothes lay and picked up her heavy wool cloak, laying it on a flat, dry rock where she could easily reach it without fully leaving the water. "Then I will be gentle," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp, his back still resolutely turned, so gentle that my hands will not dare go where my heart has not been invited. He walked back into the trees and did not look back, giving her the one thing Bixby and his world never would a choice. His eyes had claimed a memory, a vision of her that he would treasure. But his hands, his actions, would wait for the permission his heart so desperately craved. When she emerged from the stream a few minutes later, dressed and with her hair combed, the air between them was different. It was charged with a new and potent intimacy, an unspoken understanding that a profound boundary had been acknowledged and honored. They continued their journey in a comfortable silence, a new layer of trust binding them closer than any touch could have. Silas Croft's cabin was a ruin, barely more than a pile of rotting logs with a caved-in roof. It looked as if no one had set foot in it for years. Despair began to prick at Elias. This was a fool's errand. They searched the single, squalid room, finding nothing but pack-rat nests and the ghosts of a lonely, frightened man's life. Elias was about to give up when his boot scuffed against a loose flagstone in the hearth. It shifted, just slightly, but it was enough. He knelt and worked his knife into the crack. With a groan of protest, the stone came up. Beneath it was a small, dark cavity, and nestled inside was a tin box, wrapped in oilcloth. Their hearts pounded as Elias lifted it out. It was heavy. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed newspaper clippings about mining accidents, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. They opened it on the dusty floor, the afternoon light slanting through the collapsed roof. Croft's handwriting was tiny and precise, a testament to his obsessive nature. Elias turned the pages, his calloused finger tracing the columns, and then he found it. A section at the back, titled Dam Fund Dispersal. It was all there, every dollar accounted for. And every dollar was a lie. Payments listed as legal retainers to C. Bixby. Security bonuses to Sheriff H. Pike. Consulting fees to men Elias knew were nothing more than company thugs. It was a meticulous record of graft and theft. And then they saw the final entry, a huge cash withdrawal, far larger than the others. Beside the entry, Croft had written a single, shaky word, coerced, and next to that, pressed into a smear of now faded ink, was the unmistakable, world pattern of a thumbprint. "Pike," Rosalie breathed, her finger hovering over the mark. "It is him." A grin of pure, savage triumph spread across Elias's face. "We have him," he growled. "We have them all." The crack of a rifle shot shattered the moment. Wood splintered from the doorframe, inches from Elias's head. He reacted on pure instinct, shoving Rosalie flat against the floor and rolling behind the crumbling remains of the stone hearth, his own rifle in his hands. Another shot tore through the wall. They had been followed, or Bixby, anticipating their move, had sent men to wait. "Stay down," he yelled, his voice a roar in the small space. He peered over the edge of the hearth. 2 men, crouched behind trees at the edge of the clearing. Company men. Their faces were grim, their intent clear. They were not here to talk. Elias fired, the shot deliberate. Aimed not to kill, but to pin them down. He was a hunter, not a murderer, but he would defend Rosalie with his last breath. The men returned fire, the bullets thudding into the log walls of the cabin. A sharp, burning pain suddenly seared across Elias's left arm. He glanced down. A bullet had torn through the flesh of his bicep. Not deep, but it was bleeding freely, staining his sleeve a dark, wet red. He ignored the pain, his focus absolute. He waited for a lull in their firing, then rose and fired 2 shots in quick succession. One kicked up dirt at the feet of one man, and the other slammed into the tree beside the second man's head, showering him with bark. It was a statement of skill, a warning. He could have hit them. They knew it. After a moment of hesitation, they broke cover and fled, melting back into the forest. Silence fell, broken only by the drip of blood from Elias's arm onto the dusty floor. The danger was gone, but the reality of their situation had crashed down upon them. They had the proof, but in getting it, they had declared open war. Rosalie scrambled to his side, her face pale with fear but her eyes steady. "You are hurt," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Without hesitation, she ripped a long, clean strip of cloth from the hem of her petticoat. Her hands, he noticed, were not shaking as she gently took his arm. With a competence that surprised him, she cleaned the wound as best she could and bound it tightly, her touch firm and sure. He looked down at her as she worked, at her dark hair falling across her face, her brow furrowed in concentration. In that moment, she was not a girl he was protecting. She was his partner. She was a woman of courage and resolve, who faced down fear and did what needed to be done. He had opened his door to a refugee from a storm, and in doing so, had found an ally who was as strong as the mountains themselves. They looked at each other over the damning ledger, the scent of gunpowder still hanging in the air, and a silent, unbreakable pact was sealed between them. The hearing was not held in a proper courtroom, but in the main room of the Silvergate Town Hall, a large, drafty space that smelled of wet wool and stale cigar smoke. It was packed. Miners, shopkeepers, prospectors, and their wives crowded the benches, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim prejudice. This was theater, and Rosalie was the unwilling star. She sat beside Elias on a hard wooden bench, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Elias sat like a stone monument, his bandaged arm a stark reminder of their journey, his gaze fixed on Cassius Bixby. Bixby was in his element. He stood before the magistrate, a portly, disinterested man named Judge Thompson, and presented the forged contract with a flourish. His voice was smooth and reasonable, painting a picture of a benevolent company taking in a wayward orphan, only to be betrayed by her flightiness and ingratitude. He was followed by another lawyer, a man with a rat-like face, who proceeded to dissect Rosalie's character with surgical precision. He did not raise his voice. He used insinuation and loaded questions, suggesting that a young woman who would flee a place of safety and take refuge with a strange man in the mountains was clearly of questionable morals. The whispers started in the crowd, a low, ugly hiss of judgment. Rosalie felt her face burn with shame, and she shrank into herself, the walls of the room seeming to close in. Elias placed a large, steadying hand on her shoulder, a silent anchor in the swirling tide of lies. Just as the company lawyer was reaching his crescendo, the doors at the back of the room swung open with a loud bang. All heads turned. Nora Bell stood there, a vision in crimson silk, her red hair a beacon in the drab room. She held a thick ledger in her hands. Beside her, looking nervous but resolute, was Deputy Abel Crow. "Begging your pardon, Your Honor," Nora said, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room, "but I believe there is some evidence that has been overlooked in this matter." Sheriff Pike, who had been leaning against the wall with a smug look on his face, straightened up, his eyes wide with alarm. Bixby's smooth composure cracked for the first time, a flicker of cold fury in his eyes. "This is highly irregular," he protested. "This woman has no standing in this case." "I have the standing of a citizen who has witnessed a crime," Nora shot back, sweeping down the aisle and placing the ledger on the magistrate's desk with a solid thud. "This is a private expense ledger I kept during my time as a clerk for the company. You will find in it a record of numerous cash payments made out to Sheriff H. Pike for services rendered, and I have the receipts." She produced a small bundle of envelopes from her reticule, each one sealed with a familiar wax stamp. Deputy Crow stepped forward, his voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, those envelopes are sealed with the official stamp of the Silvergate Sheriff's Office. I can attest that Sheriff Pike has used that seal for private company business on numerous occasions. A clear misuse of his office." A gasp went through the crowd. This was no longer about a runaway girl. This was about the town's own lawman being on the company payroll. The magistrate, his disinterest finally broken, peered at the ledger, his brow furrowed. Bixby's face was a mask of white-hot rage. He opened his mouth to object, to spin a new web of lies. but he was cut off by a sound from outside. It began as a low, deep rumble. A vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It grew steadily, a monstrous, grinding roar that seemed to be coming from the mountains themselves. The windows of the town hall rattled in their frames. A man from the back of the room, a miner with a face pale with terror, burst through the doors. "The dam," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "The tailings dam has burst! A wall of mud is coming!" Chaos erupted. The trial, the ledgers, the contracts were all forgotten in a primal surge of fear. People scrambled for the doors, their chairs crashing to the floor. Bixby stood frozen for a second, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. Then his carefully constructed world shattered, and he was just another terrified man, pushing and shoving his way toward the exit. In the midst of the pandemonium, Elias was a point of calm. His voice boomed over the shrieks and shouts. To the high ground, get to the hills on the east side of town. Now his years as a scout, his innate understanding of the land, took over. He grabbed men by the arm, pointing, directing, his authority absolute and unquestioned. Rosalie, separated from him in the crush, did not panic. An idea, clear and certain, formed in her mind. She fought her way against the tide of fleeing people. Her destination, the small church at the end of the street. She threw open the doors and ran to the bell tower. Grabbing the thick, rough rope, she pulled with all her might. The great bronze bell, silent for so long, swung into life, its deep, resonant peal, tolling out a frantic, desperate warning. Bong, bong, bong. It was an alarm, a call to life, a sound that cut through the roar of the approaching flood. Elias, organizing the last of the stragglers, heard the bell and knew, with a certainty that filled his heart, that it was her. He saw Bixby, his fine suit spattered with mud, trying to untether his horse. The animal, spooked by the noise, reared and broke free, galloping away. Bixby was left alone, staring in horror at the approaching disaster. A thick, gray wave of sludge, studded with splintered timbers and uprooted trees, was pouring into the valley, consuming everything in its path. Elias ran, not away from the flood, but toward it, his path taking him up the slope toward the remains of the dam. He found Bixby near the breach, scrambling uselessly at the muddy bank, his face a mask of terror. The roar was deafening. Elias grabbed him by the collar and slammed him back against a rock wall that was still standing. He held up Silas Croft's ledger, its pages fluttering in the wind. "This is over, Bixby," he yelled over the din. "The money for the dam, you stole it. Sign a confession now." He shoved a piece of paper and a pencil into Bixby's trembling hands. Deputy Crow, who had followed Elias, appeared at his side, his own face pale but his eyes resolute. He was a witness. Bixby, his mind broken by fear, scribbled a frantic, illegible confession, admitting to the embezzlement of the maintenance fund. Just as he finished, a new section of the earthen wall gave way with a sickening groan. The ground beneath Bixby's feet dissolved, and he slid, screaming, toward the churning torrent of silver mud. Elias did not hesitate. He was not a killer. He was not the man he used to be. He lunged forward, his good arm shooting out, his hand clamping around Bixby's wrist. He dug his heels into the collapsing earth, his muscles straining, the wound in his other arm screaming in protest. For a moment, it was a stalemate. The man of law and the man of the wilderness locked together on the brink of destruction. Then a small, strong hand closed over his own, adding its strength. Rosalie was there. Her face was streaked with mud, her hair wild, but her eyes were blazing with a fierce, protective light. Together, they pulled, leaning back with all their combined weight. With a final, desperate heave, they dragged Bixby back onto solid ground, where he collapsed into a sobbing, pathetic heap. The roar of the flood was all around them, the tolling of the church bell, a sound of hope and warning she had started, echoed through the ruined valley. The rain began to fall, mingling with the mud and the tears on Rosalie's face. She turned to Elias, and in the heart of the chaos, with the world they knew being washed away, she threw her arms around his neck. He wrapped his own arms around her, holding her tight against him as if he would never let her go. Their love, forged in a storm and tested by law, was now sealed in the heart of a disaster, a living, breathing thing that was stronger than mud, stronger than greed, and as enduring as the mountains themselves. When the gray light of dawn broke over the ravaged valley, it revealed a scene of biblical destruction. Silvergate was buried. A thick, viscous tide of silver mud and mine tailings had submerged the lower half of the town, leaving only the rooftops of the buildings on the main street visible. The Golden Garter Saloon was a ruin, its front wall torn away. The town hall was a mud-filled shell, but the people, huddled in shivering groups on the eastern hill where Elias had sent them, were alive. The church bell, rung by Rosalie, had given them the warning they needed. They had lost their homes, their businesses, their possessions, but they had not lost their lives. In the cold, clear light of morning, the legal machinations of the previous day seemed like a fever dream. Cassius Bixby, his fine suit in tatters and his face a mask of dried mud and broken pride, was taken into custody by Deputy Abel Crow. His confession, witnessed by Elias and Crow, combined with the evidence from Silas Croft's ledger and Nora's own records, was an ironclad case. Sheriff Harlan Pike, stripped of his badge and his authority, was also arrested. His blustering protests silenced by the cold. Accusatory stares of the townsfolk he had sworn to protect and had so thoroughly betrayed. The forged indenture contract, the linchpin of Bixby's entire scheme, was declared null and void by the stunned but sobered magistrate. Rosalie was, for the first time in her adult life, legally and truly free. But the freedom felt hollow in the face of such widespread devastation. The Silvergate Consolidated Mining Company, its leadership disgraced and its infrastructure destroyed, collapsed overnight. The silver fever that had built the town had also destroyed it. In the days that followed, a strange sense of community, born of shared loss, began to take root in the mud. The rigid social hierarchy of the mining town dissolved. There were no longer company men and independent prospectors, shopkeepers and laborers. There were only survivors, led by Elias, whose quiet competence and knowledge of the land made him a natural leader. The men of the town began the back-breaking work of rebuilding. They did not start with their homes or their businesses. They started with the dam. They worked side by side, miners and merchants, digging, hauling rock, and cutting timber. Their shared sweat and effort a stronger bond than any company charter. A new community fund was established, not by a lawyer, but by the people themselves. It was overseen by a committee of three, the unimpeachable Reverend Ames, the newly appointed Sheriff Abel Crow, and, to the surprise of many, Nora Bell, whose sharp mind and honest accounting were now seen as assets, not oddities. Rosalie found her own purpose in the chaos. The woman who had fled in terror now moved with a calm and steady grace. She organized the women, setting up a communal kitchen in the miraculously undamaged church hall, feeding the hungry work crews. She tended to the injured, her hands gentle and sure. She comforted the children, who were frightened and bewildered by the loss of their homes. She saw young Ben, the boy Elias had saved from the wolves, sitting alone, his eyes wide with a trauma he could not articulate. She sat with him, not talking, but simply being present. Then she found a piece of charcoal and a clean piece of pine board and began to draw the letters of the alphabet. A, B, C. Ben watched, fascinated. Soon, other children gathered around. A makeshift school was born in the corner of the relief kitchen, a small island of order and hope in a sea of destruction. The runaway orphan, who had sought only a roof over her own head, was now building a foundation for the future of the entire town. Elias, for his part, found a different kind of peace. The ghost of his past, the man who had served the company's greed, had been washed away by the flood. He worked relentlessly, his movements economical and powerful, but there was a new lightness in him. The haunted look in his eyes was gone. replaced by a clear, steady purpose. He was no longer a hermit, hiding from the world. He was a part of it. The young men of the town, who had once whispered about the strange mountain man, now sought his guidance. He taught them how to read the weather, how to track game, how to set a trap line not for profit, but for sustenance. He was not just a hunter. He was a teacher, a steward of the wilderness he so deeply understood. He spent his days helping to rebuild the town, but as evening fell, he would make the climb back up the mountain to his small, undamaged cabin. It was no longer a refuge from the world, but a sanctuary of a different kind, a place of quiet and solitude that he now chose, rather than needed. And one evening, as he returned, he saw that Rosalie had been there. A new fence post had been set near the door. A sturdy piece of pine he had cut but not yet installed. And hanging from it, glowing warm and golden in the twilight, was his lantern. She had cleaned the glass and filled the reservoir with oil, and the small, steady flame was a beacon against the deepening purple of the mountains. He understood the gesture instantly. It was a promise, a welcome. It said that this was now a home, not just a shelter. It was a light for anyone who was lost, a symbol of the hospitality he had shown her on that first terrible night. He began to build a new fence, not a flimsy barrier to mark a claim, but a strong, well-made fence of split rails. It was not meant to keep people out, but to create a space of safety, of belonging. He was not building a wall around his solitude. He was building the foundation of a home he hoped to share. As he worked, he found that the guilt he had carried for so long had finally loosened its grip. He was not defined by the fences he had torn down in his past, but by the ones he was now building, both literally and figuratively. He was no longer running from his mistakes, but building a new life on the hard-won lessons they had taught him. The smoke from his chimney no longer smelled of loneliness, but of the promise of a shared meal and a warm hearth, a future he had never dared to dream of, now shining as brightly as the lantern on his porch. Spring came to the high country not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering force. The snow, which had held the land in a silent, white grip for months, retreated with a sound like 1,000 rushing rivers. The air, once sharp and sterile, now carried the rich, loamy scent of thawing earth and the sweet, resinous perfume of pine sap. It was a time of renewal, of life pushing its way through the cold grip of the past. Inside the small cabin, this same quiet transformation was taking place. The space, once the solitary domain of a man in self-imposed exile, was now a home, a savory steam, rich with the aroma of wild herbs and simmering venison, rose from a cast-iron pot hanging over the fire. Rosalie moved about the hearth with a calm, practiced economy, tasting the broth from a wooden spoon, her brow furrowed in concentration. The firelight caught the warm tones in her dark hair and cast a soft, golden glow on her face. Across the room, Elias was at work. He was not tanning a hide or cleaning a rifle, but planing a long, smooth plank of aspen wood. The rhythmic scrape of the tool was a soothing, domestic sound, a counterpoint to the bubbling of the pot and the crackle of the fire. He was building a table, a proper one, large enough for 2 people to sit across from each other and share a meal. The cot she had slept on that first night had been replaced by a sturdy bed frame he had built, and the patchwork quilt she had finished now lay across it, a vibrant testament to their joined lives. He stopped his work, running his large, calloused hand over the satiny surface of the wood. These hands had known violence. They had held the reins of a company horse, the stock of a rifle used to intimidate innocent families. They had set traps, skinned animals, and fought for a lonely survival. Now, they were learning a new language, the language of creation, of building something meant to last, something meant for peace. He looked over at Rosalie, who was now kneading a small round of dough on a floured board. She was humming a soft, tuneless melody, a sound of simple contentment that struck him with a force greater than any bullet. He had never known this kind of quiet. His life had been a landscape of loud, jarring noises, the crack of gunfire, the roar of a blizzard, the even louder silence of a profound and crushing loneliness. The peace he had found with her was more precious than any silver nugget ever pulled from the dark earth. That evening, they sat before the fire, the rich stew warming their bowls. The new table stood in the center of the room, unfinished but full of promise. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a shared space, comfortable and deep. Elias stared into the flames, the words he had been carrying in his heart for weeks finally rising to the surface. "I used to think this mountain was a place to hide," he began, his voice a low rumble. "A place to bury the man I had been down in the valley, the company man." Rosalie looked at him, her spoon pausing halfway to her lips. She did not speak, but her eyes, dark and soft in the firelight, invited him to continue. "Every rock, every tree, was a reminder of what I was running from. My past was a stain I could not wash out. I thought if I just stayed up here long enough, I would forget, but I never did." He set his bowl aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze still fixed on the dancing flames. "The night you came here, you were running from a storm, but you brought something with you, a light, like that lantern you keep lit on the porch." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were filled with a raw, vulnerable honesty she had never seen before. "That day, by Glacier Creek, when I saw you in the water, it was like seeing the world for the first time. Clean, pure, all the mud and the lies and the blood from my past. It felt like the creek was washing it all away. You washed it away. Rosalie." He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small, heavy object. He opened his hand. Lying on his palm was a simple, unadorned silver ring. It was not professionally made. He could see the faint marks of a hammer on its surface, but it shone with a soft, pure luster in the firelight. "I took an old silver dollar," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The kind of coin that built that town, and then destroyed it. The kind of coin I used to get paid for doing things I am ashamed of. I took it to the forge down in the new smithy's shop. I melted it down, burned away all the greed, all the history, all the men who touched it before me." He looked from the ring back to her face. "I made this. I made it clean again. I made it for you. For us." He did not get down on one knee. The gesture would have been foreign to him, a piece of theater that did not fit the simple, profound truth of the moment. He simply held out the ring, an offering from his remade soul. "Rosalie Hart," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "Will you make this cabin our home? Will you be my wife?" Tears welled in Rosalie's eyes, spilling over and tracing silent, glistening paths down her cheeks. She did not make a sound. She simply nodded, a slow, certain movement of her head. He took her left hand in his large, rough fingers surprisingly gentle as he slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. She looked at the ring, then back at his hand, which was still holding hers. She covered it with her other hand, her small, slender fingers a stark contrast to his own. She brought his hand up, her gaze tracing the lines and calluses, the map of his hard life. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, a smile that reached all the way to her tear-filled eyes. "That day," she whispered, her voice soft as a spring breeze, "I was afraid someone so large might break me. It turns out a gentle love is the real strength." Their wedding was a quiet affair, held on a bright spring day in the valley below. The town of Silvergate was being reborn, new timbers rising from the mud, the sounds of hammers and saws a chorus of resilience. The ceremony was held in the meadow where Elias had saved young Ben from the wolves, a place of fear transformed into a place of new beginnings. The entire town was there. Nora Bell stood beside Rosalie, her crimson dress a splash of defiant joy against the greening landscape. Sheriff Abel Crow stood beside Elias, his presence a symbol of a new, honest law. Reverend Ames officiated, his voice filled with a genuine, heartfelt warmth. Ben and his family were there, as were the miners and their wives, their faces no longer filled with suspicion, but with a quiet, respectful admiration. The whispers and the judgment that had once followed them down the main street were gone, washed away by the flood, replaced by the bonds of a shared survival and a common, hard-won truth. As Reverend Ames spoke of promises and faith, the clear, resonant sound of the church bell began to toll from the valley, a slow, celebratory peal. The same bell she had rung to warn them of disaster was now ringing to announce their union. It was not a sound of alarm, but of hope, a testament to the fact that out of the greatest destruction can come the most profound and beautiful new beginnings. Elias looked at Rosalie, the silver ring shining on her finger, and knew that he was finally, truly home. A year passed, the seasons turned, and the raw scars on the valley floor began to heal. New grass, vibrant and green, grew over the mud flats, and the people of Silvergate, with a resilience born of hardship, built their town anew. The new buildings were smaller, more practical, and built of stone and sturdy timber, as if in defiance of any future flood. The silver fever was gone, replaced by a quieter, more sustainable life of logging, trapping, and the slow, steady work of building a community. On the high slopes of Elk Ridge, the cabin that had once been a hermit's refuge was now a home in the truest sense of the word. The split rail fence Elias had built now enclosed a thriving garden, its rows of beans, squash, and potatoes a testament to Rosalie's patient hands. A riot of wildflowers she had transplanted from the meadow grew along the fence line, a splash of color against the dark wood. The cabin itself seemed to have settled into the landscape, no longer a temporary shelter, but a permanent part of the mountain. Most afternoons, Elias could be found in the woods, but he was rarely alone. A small, devoted following of young boys from the town, led by a taller, more confident Ben, often made the climb to his cabin. Elias, the solitary hunter, had become a teacher. He taught them not how to kill, but how to see. He showed them how to read the story of a bent twig, a paw print in the soft earth, the flight of a hawk on the wind. He taught them respect for the wilderness, a language of signs and silences that he had once thought was his alone to speak. Today, he was showing them how to find north using the sun and a stick, his large hands surprisingly deft as he explained the movement of shadows. "The mountain will always tell you where you are," he said, his voice a low, patient rumble. "You just have to learn how to listen." Rosalie watched them from the porch, a quiet smile on her face. She had just returned from her day in town, her saddlebags filled with flour, salt, and a precious bundle of new books for her school. The makeshift classroom in the church hall had grown, and she now had more than 20 students, the children of miners and merchants learning their letters side by side. The woman who had once been defined by a forged debt was now an architect of the town's future, her quiet strength and unwavering kindness a cornerstone of the new Silvergate. She carried the supplies inside, the familiar, comforting scent of wood smoke and baking bread enveloping her. The table Elias had built stood in the center of the room, its surface scrubbed clean and smooth from a year of shared meals. Her patchwork quilt, a vibrant map of their joined lives, lay across their bed. This small cabin, once a symbol of loneliness and escape, was now the center of her entire world. It was the home she had dreamed of, a place of safety and love that was more real and more precious than she had ever imagined. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, casting long golden fingers of light across the valley, she brought Elias a cup of coffee as he sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle. The boys had long since departed, their youthful whoops and hollers echoing down the trail. "Nora sends her regards," Rosalie said, settling into the chair beside him. "She also sends a rumor." Elias stopped his work, his hands stilling on the oiled cloth. He looked at her, his expression calm and questioning. "Surveyors," she said simply. "From the Denver and Rio Grande. They were seen over in the next county, marking a line through the pass. The talk in town is that the railroad is coming to Silvergate." A few years ago, that news would have been a death knell to his peace. The railroad meant noise. It meant crowds. It meant the arrival of the very world he had fled. It meant the coming of new and more powerful companies, with their own lawyers and their own contracts, their own insatiable hunger for the land. It was the same threat, just on a larger, more impersonal scale. He looked out over the valley, at the thin ribbon of smoke rising from the town, at the vast, silent expanse of the mountains beyond. He was not afraid. The fear that had lived in him for so long, the fear of his own past and of the world of men, was gone. "Let them come," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This valley has seen its share of men who think a piece of paper gives them the right to own the earth. We know how to answer them now." Rosalie reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "Yes," she said, "we do." They were not alone anymore. They had a community, forged in disaster and tempered by a shared commitment to justice. They had friends like Nora Bell and Sheriff Crow, and the trust of the good people of the town. They had each other. They would not be broken. They would not run. They would stand together. As dusk settled, bleeding the sky with shades of lavender and rose, Elias rose and went to the post by the door. He struck a match, the small flame flaring to life in the gathering dark, and lit the wick of the lantern. The warm, golden light pushed back the shadows, creating a small, perfect circle of home and safety. They stood together on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. They watched the first stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the night sky. Down below, the lights of the new Silvergate began to wink on, one by one, a small, defiant constellation of their own making. The gentle sound of Glacier Creek, the same water that had borne witness to their most vulnerable moment, murmured its timeless song as it flowed past the cabin on its journey down to the valley. The light from their lantern, their steadfast beacon, spilled out from the porch and touched the surface of the moving water. A shimmering, unbroken reflection. Freedom, they had both learned, was not found in escaping the world. It was found in facing it, in healing its wounds, in building a life of purpose and love in the very heart of its beautiful, dangerous, and unpredictable wilderness. The past was not a stain to be washed away, but a story to be learned from, a history that gave them the strength to face whatever the future might hold. And in the quiet peace of the mountain evening, under the watchful gaze of the ancient peaks, the small, steady light of their lantern burned brightly, a promise that no matter how dark the night, a welcome and a safe harbor would always be waiting. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.